Welcome to Robson Radio, the official podcast of the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Law. This podcast is recorded on the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Ininewuk, Anishinaabeg, Dakota Oyate, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. This podcast comes to you from the MLT Aikens classroom at Robson Hall and was created using equipment kindly sponsored by MLT Aikens. The goal of Robson Radio is to tell the story of Western Canada's oldest law school. Each episode features an interview with one of our professors, directors, staff, students, or alumni, all of whom make our law school an exciting, relevant, innovative, and transformational place to be. My name is Christine Mazur, and I'm the Communications Officer at the Faculty of Law, and your host for today. The introductory music for today's podcast is titled simply New Song and was written, performed, and recorded entirely by today's guest, Dr. Richard Jochelson, Dean of Law, who, in a previous life, spent some time as a musician. Welcome to Episode 1. Today, I have with me Dr. Richard Jochelson, Dean of the Faculty of Law and Professor. Let me just tell you a little bit about him by way of introduction, and then I'm going to ask him some nosy questions about what he does and his vision for the law school. Richard Jochelson is the Dean of Law as of July 1st, 2021 was when you started your appointment.
Yes.
And you hold a PhD in law from Osgoode Law School at York University, a Master of Laws from the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of Calgary Faculty of Law, gold medalist no less, and a Bachelor of Science in Zoology with distinction, also from the University of Calgary. He served his articling year as a clerk at the Alberta Court of Appeal and Court of Queen's Bench before working at one of Canada's largest law firms. And he taught criminal law for 10 years at the University of Winnipeg prior to joining the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Law in 2016. I want to talk a little bit about some of your research profile. You have disseminated over 70 publications, very fascinating research that you've done. There's a number of books that you've published even still recently while busily working as Dean of Law, including Ancillary Police Powers in Canada, a critical reassessment that came out this fall, Justice in the Age of Agnosis, Socio-Legal Explorations of Denial, Deception, and Doubt, which came out also last spring. You have edited many volumes of the criminal law edition of the Manitoba Law Journal over the years that you've been a professor here. And I should mention that you are a professor specializing in teaching criminal law and procedure, charter issues in criminal law, and sexual expression, conduct, and work in Canada. So these are fascinating areas that you are working and researching and teaching in. So what I'd like to know, to start with, what are your current research projects?
So I'm still working on materials related to ancillary police powers, which was the book that had more recently come out. There's always updates to do there in new cases, so I suspect there'll be a few articles coming from some of those developments. And I'm still on a pedagogy and legal teaching research project where we're looking at mental health of law students and their ways of learning during the COVID pandemic and after. So that's an ongoing project. You know, all of the work I do relates to the rights apparatus of the charter. There was a couple of SSHRC-funded projects in there. So essentially, right before the COVID lockdowns, we were going to attend a number of jury trials for in-person observation, and with two goals in mind. One was to sort of drill down on the jury instructions piece, and in particular, whether a juror could understand the judicial instructions. Now, the judicial instructions are pretty standardized. There's an approach that's usually used on the West Coast. There's an approach that's used in Ontario and beyond, and some judges just have their own instructions. There's also Canadian Judicial Council instructions, and they're all quite formalistic and very legalistic. So one thing we were interested in was whether effectively the average juror could comprehend these instructions, especially when they're layered, because a lot of them require multiple legal tests that might trifurcate in step two, and it becomes kind of a decision tree. And how do jurors actually comprehend that? So we did a set of experiments with that. First, we found that the degree of sophistication that most of the jurors can understand is well below the level of writing or instructing that's happening at the judicial level. So there was a massive lack of comprehension. I mean, it's quite staggering, and it kind of proved what the literature shows, which is that these instructions are hard to follow in the way the charges are delivered. With the COVID lockdowns, we sort of pivoted to thinking through a little bit of could juries work in a virtual format, and ultimately we came back for a second shirk, researching the degree to which juries have adequate representation, that the jury is representative of the community it's serving. And that's an ongoing project. We've deployed research assistants across Canada, hundreds and hundreds of jury observations in the bank right now, just sitting on a server somewhere. A team of about 20 RAs over the last several years since things opened up. The big picture of that is essentially juries aren't representative. There's no jurisdiction that's doing well with this. So the issues there aren't simply a question of bad mathematics by sheriffs and, uh, and jury offices across the country, although that's part of it. They don't use very good mathematical formula for sampling representatively, but it's also the incentive structure for jury service that selects for a type of a homogenous jury. So the amount you get paid to serve, the distance you have to travel, although it's not supposed to be relevant, the relationship between you and your employer when you have to take time away, your caregiving responsibilities. And so obviously in Manitoba, that affects Indigenous communities disproportionately and creates a representativeness issue. We don't pay as much attention to underrepresentation in justice making enterprises.
One of your books actually was on law and disability in Canada, but I think that was a textbook, was it?
Yeah, it's a case book,
Yeah.
and that was essentially a project started by Laverne Jacobs trying to put together as large a compendium as possible of disability in the law topics. So it covers a number of things. The part that I contribute with my co-authors onto that, the way disability affects the investigative process, essentially anytime the police are involved with an accused. Then we looked at, of course, the trial process, which is a more well-worn road, but for the purposes of a casebook, we had to mention it.
Yeah.
And then we also looked at inquests in Manitoba to see the amount of times that disability is part of the constellation of wrongful deaths. And of course, it's disproportionately overrepresented in those inquest decisions. However, it's seldom relied on as a key component of the findings and recommendations from those inquests.
When you were in law school, let's switch gears here a little to the practice of law and learning, because you are the dean of our Faculty of Law here in Manitoba at Robson Hall. And your experience in law school, did you have a lot of hands-on opportunities? And when you came away from law school, what were your thoughts on ensuring that students have hands-on practical experience practicing law? Because criminal law, the practice of criminal law is quite nuanced, or quite like you have to work with clients, you have to stand on your feet and speak in public, and there's a lot to be done in practice that you may not necessarily get in the classroom. So
leaving law school, and I was in a very practical law school by the metrics of the time, which was University of Calgary. There was some opportunity to do that work, but it was very intimidating, I think, as for the average law student. And certainly for myself, I sort of found myself, especially having come from a science background,
right.
I definitely found the learning curve was intense in law school, and the chance to sort of delve into the practical side of things in a safe way and then a more intensive way, that pathway wasn't very clear. And certainly when I moved into my articling year, and my articling was a split articles between the courts and a firm,
Mhm.
I didn't feel confident about certainly certainly the solicitor skills, but even the barrister skills. I felt I could be relatively confident in a verbal setting. I thought I could develop that skill, but some of the more menial tasks, I guess, the basics of filing and getting to courts and speaking to sentence, even like, just these very, very basic things, I felt, I think, underprepared for.
Mhm.
And I think it would have probably taken till year, 3 or 4 or 5 to get that confidence. So that definitely was an experience that stuck with me when I went off to grad school before getting to years 3, 4, and 5. There is this disconnect, and that disconnect between law school and practice is the common route, right? There are ways at every law school to get involved in practice, but you have to be very proactive.
Mhm.
In some cases, you have to have sharp elbows, I think, because sometimes those opportunities are quite sought after. But the idea of getting in with real clients in higher profile clinics remains a challenge for students that are coming from the outside, or I think are introverted, or maybe are coming from more marginalized spaces. So that was definitely something I noticed
Right,
and noticed for a long time.
right. So University of Calgary had a lot of opportunities. I know for a fact University of Alberta has Student Legal Services of Edmonton, and so that gives students an opportunity to volunteer and get some hands-on experience talking to clients and going to court. In fact, we had t-shirts that said, "Don't let school get in the way of your education," and a lot of us had to skip class to go to court. But so here, uh, when you started teaching here, there was the UMCLC, the University of Manitoba Community Law Center, which is a collaboration with Legal Aid Manitoba. And that was kind of the biggest hands-on opportunity or clinic for our law students at the time. It, in fact, just celebrated its 50th anniversary.
Hmm.
And then after we've added a few more clinics, can you talk about what experiential learning opportunities there are currently at
Sure.
the Faculty of Law in Manitoba?
Well, as you pointed out, UMCLC has a 50-year history. It's a cooperative endeavor with legal aid, historically limited mainly to criminal law or soft criminal law files, and relies on, to its great credit, a lot of volunteerism from the bar. And so that was not a clinic that we wanted to change, but we wanted to build upon it. Um, so just to sort of reflect that UMCLC did actually grow as well in the interim. So now they do family law files, they do administrative law files, and they've started a prison law clinic, which we're happy to partner with them on.
Yep. Yeah, that was recently in the news,
And
wasn't
that
it?
was recently in the
Yeah.
news. There was an Indigenous woman from up north who, when she was in town for a routine appointment, was essentially apprehended because there was reason to believe she wasn't effectively getting her treatments for tuberculosis, and which is allowed, under provincial legislation, the ability to sort of detain someone in that context, in a public health safety context. But it ended up that she was kept in a carceral institution, so she was incarcerated for well over a month, I believe.
Mhm.
Might have been just a month. I can't recall the exact details. So one of our students in the prison law clinic under UMCLC, working with the director of the prison law clinics, Leif Jansen, they were able to essentially, through habeas corpus, get her released in time for the holidays, which was a good news story. And then the premier was able to sort of issue an edict that will prevent that from being possible
Mhm.
again. But that's, an example of how these clinics are not only great experiences for the student, because I'm sure the student who was
Yeah.
involved with that file probably had a life-changing experience,
Yeah.
making that kind of difference in a person's life. But it's also gratifying, I think, from a law school perspective, as persons working in the law school, to see that our students are contributing to very meaningfully to access to justice outcomes for people in the community, right?
Yeah.
So that's a really critical example of the sort of dual benefit of excellent experiential learning, in my view, which is that the student can gain skills, confidence, certain insights that they couldn't get in the classroom, although they're certainly informed by the classroom. I mean, you'd be a less capable advocate if you hadn't had
Mhm.
robust education. But there's obviously something intangible there that is case dependent and is dependent on actually getting both the hands-on experience with that particular client, but also the meaningful supervision by the lead lawyer, right? So that those are things that well, you can't really put a price on. If those that go to our website and look up clinics will find the Vicar clinic comes up pretty fast as well, and that's our business law clinic.
Yeah.
It
El
has
Carey Vicar
El Carey
Business
Vicar
Law
Business Law
Clinic.
Clinic,
Yeah.
it's a great experience for students in a number of ways. One is they're working on business law files, which can be harder opportunities to get in law school. I mean, you get your business law courses, but
Right.
actually working with clients in that context is challenging.
Yeah.
And really they're really a startup business
Yeah.
clinic. So for emerging entrepreneurs. So it also fits nicely into the broader university missions of entrepreneurship and innovation.
Yeah.
So people come to them with startup ideas. They get them sorted out in a very kind of preliminary way. These are folks that wouldn't otherwise get this opportunity because they couldn't afford a lawyer. And it extends through to advice on licensing and intellectual property. And in fact, they've been doing a lot of intellectual property work in
They've
that
just,
startup
yeah,
innovation space.
yeah, they've just started up that Manitoba Legal Clinic for the Arts.
Again, I guess an offshoot of the Vicar Clinic, and this has to do with the great people, who are leading it. Yvonne Larocque is the clinical counsel there. Nick Slonowski is sort of working in tandem with him as a
Right.
community supervisor, and really the idea of a Vicar Clinic really expanded during COVID when Nick stepped in to sort of do this as a virtual experience. But since then, it's grown. So of course, we have the downstairs clinical space, which Carey Vicar was an important philanthropist for, and that's an exciting space.
He's one of our alumni, class
And
of
one of our alumni.
1980. Yeah.
And comes back and visits every year for a meeting with the students, of course, and
Yeah.
they love to hear his stories, and then they have a Q&A, and that's a very enriching experience.
Yeah.
But then the students, through both of those opportunities, the Vicar Clinic as well as the Arts Clinic, also have occasion to go out and work in community. And in community, it could be a First Nations community in the north, and they've gone to a few information sessions in that context. It could be to a meeting of Northern creators. They've done that. Or it could be as simple as popping across campus and going to work at North Forge with the startup entrepreneurs who are in and around campus working with that entity. So
Right.
so
Yeah.
they're kind of all over the place doing all sorts of exciting things. And it's in that you sort of ask, how does that relate to access to justice?
Yeah.
And that's at least what I would be thinking if I was listening to my monologue. And so
Yeah.
I would say access to innovation is an important part of access to justice, especially in a province like Manitoba, where there's so many creative and entrepreneurial people who are at great distances or in remote communities that don't have access to this kind of service, advice, conversations even.
Oh, absolutely. Well, the students were just out in Brandon for an arts event, a gathering of arts organizations, a sort of symposium or get together. And actually, a friend of mine who works in the arts community as an arts administrator in rural Manitoba met up with some of our students and was so relieved to hear that they would be able to get help for that arts organization, not for profit, to be able to get some of our students to assist them with various needs. And it is definitely an access to justice situation.
Yeah, it's interesting. Another project I saw, there's helping with board governance. And so I saw a recent letter of commendation from a regionally relevant
Yeah.
museum,
Okay.
which was thankful for all of the help with the board governance and bylaws that the Vicar Clinic worked on. So
Right.
there's another access to innovation piece, which is getting not-for-profits who are doing amazing access work or public education work or
Yeah.
truth and reconciliation work,
Yes.
governance setup without having to get into the substantial costs of hiring council.
Mhm.
And these are organizations that don't have thousands of dollars to spare. So that's a gap we can fill also when the not-for-profit meets our kind of mandate of access to justice.
Right. And there's also an international human rights clinic, isn't there?
Yeah, we've opened up an international human rights clinic this last year, and that's still in development. And the concept there, and it's, I think we're
Mhm.
definitely in the pilot year.
Yeah.
The concept there is simply, we're starting off with, I think, what we can wrap our hands around, and it's the same sort of concept, but with the NGO side of things. Or are there any not-for-profits or charities in Manitoba that would otherwise be engaging in human rights work but can't because they're short-staffed and their budget doesn't allow them to reach out to that level. So we've had a few of our students work on those kinds of projects, and you would have seen some of them in some of your news stories. Some of the youth chiefs from various communities have actually been the first youth chiefs to ever present to Geneva
Right.
at the United Nations.
To clarify,
Yeah,
two of the youth chiefs are our law students.
that's correct.
Yes,
Yes.
we're
Yeah.
very lucky to have these a number of individuals who are serving the community in many ways already and are already leaders in their communities and who are our students at the same time. So it's a heavy burden they carry, but they're amazing.
Yeah, they're amazing. They're superstars, and they've really helped to provide some contour to the International Human Rights Clinic in these early phases. But there's other projects that folks are doing with community agencies, connecting them with relevant UN conventions, and it's just at the earliest starting points.
Right. And there's also an Indigenous law clinic. There's the Cochrane Sinclair
Yeah,
Indigenous Law Clinic.
that's
That's
right.
fairly
Yeah,
new.
so that's again in the context of a partnership.
Right.
There's certain files that, I mean, they're a law firm and they do have to actually
Right.
have a payroll to maintain, and they have to be a going concern and successful. But there's files by virtue of the kind of work that they do that they maybe can't
Mhm.
take care of because they're frankly they don't pay enough, or there's just not enough warm bodies
Yeah.
around to do it. So in those files, and these might be smaller matters, they do partner with our extern students
Yeah.
to come up with some research and some initial deliverables. And
Yeah.
so that moves over time. It's clear that this year what we're seeing is, especially in Indigenous communities that are remote, a need for wills and basic wills and estates advice. And so that's one way that students are connecting there. And historically, up until this year, they're also doing outreach
Mhm.
to high school students that had larger representations of Indigenous students who are interested in the possibility of law school and learning a little bit about law in general.
Mhm.
The other thing that's happening in that space is connections with the University College of the North.
Right.
So
Yeah.
helping to students who are in a pre-law program here that the Director of Indigenous Legal Learning and Services here, Mark Cruz,
Yep. Who I'll be
uh,
speaking to soon.
he'll be speaking to soon. He helped make that connection
Yeah.
and develop some of the curriculum for a program at UCN, which will attempt to provide a pathway for students to get into law school. And that is one of the gaps, of course, that everyone in our sector has identified, is that we are getting people coming to practice law from the North or remote communities at a much, much smaller percentage of people going back.
Yes. To think that, oh, I'd like to be a lawyer, but it would mean having to go to Winnipeg, and I don't really want to go there, and I don't want to leave my community, and so I won't bother. But this allows, it opens doors, right? It allows people to think differently about that and to not feel like this is unattainable.
Right. And because of the opportunities we've developed with legal aid, we've developed a Northern externship program for credit
Right.
that would also allow potentially a candidate in that kind of situation to spend 12 to 15 credit hours a half year, or so in their community doing that. The other part, if we can get through these first, several years of experimenting, there's the possibility of creating a program that's an exception to the usual online learning requirements, and maybe invert that and have like 30% in person and 70% for people coming from marginalized communities.
Yeah.
So that's a potential
Mhm.
thing we have our eye on for the future.
So I want to talk about truth and reconciliation and the role that our faculty is playing in it. So the University of Manitoba, Manitoba generally is a province deep in history that is connected very strongly to Indigenous people living in in this area. Like I said in our acknowledgement at the beginning, we're a Treaty One territory. There's a very deep, rich history, both in the law, the legal system here. Manitoba has a large Indigenous population, and it behooves us as Manitoba's only law school to be leaders in truth and reconciliation. We are literally down the road from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation here on the Fort Garry campus. And as the crow flies, you can, if it weren't for the trees on the riverbank, you could see the home of Louis Riel, father of Manitoba, a Métis leader. What's your vision for our role in being leaders in truth and reconciliation?
The service side of the law school is for sure geared towards providing assistance to clients coming from Indigenous communities or who have Indigenous identity. So it's important to not just learn about it, but also to do the work. And so I think, that's what how it connects to our clinical program. We owe, I think,
Mhm.
something to this province because of our particular relationship in the inception of the province with Indigenous persons. In particular, you mentioned Louis Riel Métis persons, but also the First Nations,
Yes.
those who have treaties and even those that haven't, and then folks, Inuit persons who have made their way
Mhm.
into these territories, and there's a special relationship, obviously ethically and morally, but also in some contexts constitutionally, right?
Yeah.
So as a law school, we have to obviously honor that piece, and we also owe it in terms of the treaty obligations as well, which includes not necessarily taking the treaties as written, but
Yeah.
interpreting them as intended or even as they've grown over time. And then it includes what to make of new treaties like the recent Red River Métis Nation treaty that we have here, and of course the founding of the province, which some say is the first
Mhm.
the first treaty uh, in the establishment of Manitoba. So so we have these obligations that sort of transcend law, but they are part of law. So one thing we have to do is reorient our legal education to encompass that. The Federation requires some of this, of course, so we're bound by that. But I think that's a compliance minimum, and we have to do more. So we've taken some steps there. We did look at 144 credit hours of course materials and reconstructed them to make sure that there was Indigenous content across all of those offerings. So that was across all of the required courses and a number of options, essentially. Again, that's, not everything, but it's important for that to be in writing and for our obligations to be clear there.
I will be discussing that in detail with Mark Cruz, our Director of Legal Learning and Services. He was involved in uh, indigenization of our curriculum.
Absolutely. Mark's been instrumental in that. So that's a piece of what we've done. We've also made a second year course on Indigenous theories and perspectives mandatory. So that's, a regular part of our second year curriculum that really is partially in response to the calls to action, in particular 28, but others. And it sort of it encompasses an introduction to treaties, to how settlement of the prairies happened, to various events of import, including the atrocities that were residential schools,
Right.
some introduction to what we're all kind of doing across law schools, which is embracing the idea of understanding Indigenous legal orders, which are very much in terms of the way law schools articulate them. I mean, that part is in flux, but it's super interesting because it's an excavation of sorts, but it's an excavation only from the perspective of a law school. These are existing legal orders that need to be understood, in a legal context, and need to be in some ways understood how they would apply now, and that work is happening across all law schools, and it can be very
Yeah.
there's a universality to it, but it can also be very determined or related to the region you're in. So in our case, Manitoba is obviously incredibly relevant with the demographics of the province, but there's also lots of relevance in some of the traditions and orders we might see in the Dakotas, for example. So it causes us to rethink the jurisdiction of laws.
Mhm.
And I think we're all really waiting for a moment or expecting a moment where Indigenous legal orders will be part of the way we conceive of Canada, the same way we think of the common law and civil law systems, right? And I think that's law schools have to be receptive for that and even building towards that. So our curriculum has been modified to be receptive and ready for that, and that's where some of the other options courses that have been developed in recent years come into play. Obviously, we have Mark Cruz as the Director of Indigenous Legal Learning and Services. Since Mark has been here, we've also hired Leo Basketwang, who is studied in Indigenous legal orders in the context of educational law. Daniel Diamond, who is, you know, an early career professor interested in Indigenous legal orders, but also interested in legal history in the context of Indigenous rights, and he's teaching property law for us currently, and as well as his seminars. Our full professor, Brenda Gunn, who's a critical community member, she brings in an expertise in Métis law and identity, which is some super fascinating articles she's written in that space. And also, I mean, probably more well known just because it has reach beyond Canada for her expertise on UNDRIP. It's for, you know, for a faculty of, I think we're at 23 or so persons now. There's a good range of perspectives there. And then we have the very, you know, our Manitoba Indigenous Law Students Association kind of have, you know, the two student governments. So the Manitoba Law Students Association and the Manitoba Indigenous Law Students Association, and over time they'll work out how that relationship works, right? But the MILSA group has just been every year since I've been here has just been a more and more outstanding group of young people. Say young people, but you know, many of them are maybe you know, fully formed adults, I would say.
Some of
But
are already
young, it's
professional.
relative
Yeah.
to my age, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to call them young people. But they've gone off and just I mean they're just like rock stars, right? They're just doing we've talked about a couple of them, but
Mhm.
almost to a person, that group of students is just incredible in terms of the leadership role they have in the law school, in terms of the initiative they show in bringing other perspectives in the law school, in terms of their partnership and developing new ideas, working both with Mark and myself, and just in their honesty, right? So the pathway forward, I think, is working together in partnership to construct on the artifice of what's here.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
essentially a new set of deals and arrangements, right? And
Decolonizing.
well, yeah, I mean, I don't, you know, I don't like that word because
Okay.
you know, I think people use it and they're entitled to, and it's an academic term of art, and
Sure.
it's an activism term of art, and you know, this has been a colonized space, right?
Right.
It's a total colonized space.
Mhm.
You look around most law buildings, and
Yeah.
it's a colonizing space. Like in our case, if folks could look around the room as I'm looking around, you know, concrete pillars built up, what you know, in a very kind of brutalist, you know, context, and you walk it, it feels like a state building, right?
A framed copy of the Magna Carta up in the faculty room.
Exactly. So I mean,
Right.
the space is colonial, and Canada, right, is
Right.
colonial, and I don't suspect that's changing, right? The sort of infrastructure, the intellectual and legal infrastructure of what it means to be a state that formed, you know, in the late 1800s, that, you know, was an offshoot of a contest between Britain and France, is going. I mean, of course, that's the very definition of you know, a state that required dispossession and marginalization of populations, right?
Mhm.
Of course, it's so like decolonizing it
Mhm.
is, you know, for me, not an option, just as a practical reality.
Yeah.
The question is, how do we renovate, right?
Yeah.
How do we rebuild? How do we build over, right? How do we move forward, given that everyone that is here now has to find a way to share the land, the resources, the opportunities, the deficits, right? And then, there is a backwards looking process. There's, I think the process of there's a retributive aspect that, we wrestle with as a society. There's a reparative
Right.
aspect that we wrestle with as a society.
Mhm.
And those aspects in a law school we can't necessarily change. There's room for those things.
Right.
But we can change the future
Yeah.
here, right? And that's sort of where I focus. Rebuilding, reframing, regenerating, rearticulating, being iterative and reiterative towards better outcomes
Right.
is a path forward. Now, having said that, if by decolonizing we mean sovereignty for Indigenous persons when they want it,
Mhm.
then yeah, for sure. But I see that as a forward progression, right? That's not some sort of devolution or regression. That's progression, right? There might very well be nations that see sovereignty as their path forward, and Canada has a role to play in making that available as an option. There's also going to be persons who in their communities want relationships with Canada as part of Canada,
Mhm.
right? And then there's going to be persons, Indigenous persons who just simply want to live in Canada with like full access, rights, amenities, options, and that sort of thing. So we have to be prepared for, as legal practitioners, as legal educators,
Yeah.
we have to be prepared for how do we build all of those possibilities. We're not programming which one of those or which combination of those things
Yeah.
is the right one, right? But we have to be prepared for how can we actually
Right.
facilitate that, right? And that's our job. So I think, we want to take our colonial edifice,
Yes.
which, is apart from, a
Yeah.
horrible conflict, right?
Yeah.
Is likely to be the edifice of which we all sort of experience for
Mhm.
our lifetimes and probably our children's lifetimes and our grandchildren's lifetimes and figure out how to make it a better space for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. So your description of edifice is reflecting what Robson Hall looks like if it's a giant piece of concrete, very
That's right.
cubist sort of.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the
Yeah.
things that is so hard about the work of a law school, I think, is
Yeah.
there is a lot of pain and trauma,
Mhm.
right, in the work that we do.
Yeah.
Law is, at least Canadian law is a relatively short history, right? The
Mhm.
common law of Canada is a relatively short history. It's somewhat finite. Like we can find all the cases, right?
Right.
We can find all the statutes, and so it's the colonial history
Yeah.
of Canada, right? So it's not a full telling
Right.
of the history. And as the Indigenous legal orders piece becomes recognized, articulated in a way that all law students are able to access it to the extent it's relevant or permitted, right? Because
Mhm.
there's obviously ownership issues related to some of the stuff, and also some spirituality issues that relate to the sacredness of certain teachings and things like that.
Yeah.
As that begins to happen, our reflection on the history, the legal history, the common law and civil law history of Canada,
Yeah.
will change, right? It'll change in the sense of it'll become more fulsome, and the way we think of Canada and see Canada in terms of what it is and what it's developing into. There's no amount of resources. There's no amount of curricular reform.
Mhm.
There's no amount of opportunity that that can rectify the wrongs, right? Like there's an endless hole of wrongs. Which doesn't mean you don't try to do the things necessary to
Yeah.
improve things, but you cannot ever say, well, as an example, we put $100,000 of funding into issue X this year.
Yeah.
Every student was able to travel to conference Y, and therefore we've done our bit, right? Like that.
Yeah.
That is not the way we're gonna make any progress. So I think it just has to. And frankly, when I've had occasion to talk to students,
Yeah.
in those kind of quiet, reflective moments, and in some Indigenous students, this is not obviously universal.
Right.
You really get a sense. You really feel the just through perception and empathy.
Yeah.
You can feel the visceral layer of trauma and survived or very close to adjacent genocidal experiences that they've been on the receiving end of. And you realize that there's nothing you can do as an individual alone, right? Really to to change that, right? No, you can't change that, and you can't make it better.
Yeah.
You can be the start of building something um, that can help move the tanker ship,
Right.
in a different direction. And the Indigenous students that we've had at Robson Hall have been so excited to be part of that project. At the same time, I mean, they've rightly called us out where we've let them down as an institution, as a law school, as a university. Um,
Yeah.
but they're doing it in a way, in my view, that is constructive and forward looking.
Yeah.
And so, as painful and as real as that can be, and it can be very confronting when you haven't lived your whole life
Yeah.
from this sort of perspective, it's a very constructive set of experiences and reflections that they provide for us. So some of the things we've talked about are sort of steps to get us moving in the right direction, but none of them are perfect. We have all sorts of opportunities for Indigenous students that want to take advantage of them. But at the end of the day, this is a hundreds of years long mission that law schools are going to have to be on.
And for a law school that's been around 110 years now,
110 years.
isn't that amazing?
I was reading U of T is
Yeah.
celebrating the 75th anniversary of their modern law school.
Really? Yeah.
And I know people don't usually say U of T in the same sentence as any of the prairie schools. But I just want to say,
Yeah.
welcome to the club, kid.
Yeah. Yeah. We passed our century 10 years ago already, established in 1914. We've come a long way, haven't we?
Yeah, I mean, I think we literally have the evidence in our graduating class photos of
Yeah.
how substantially we've changed, right? And
Mhm.
these last few years, if you believe the Office of Institutional Analysis, which that's the university central repository for calculating demographics,
Right.
we are getting close to adequate representation
Okay.
for Indigenous communities in Manitoba. We're sitting somewhere in the 15 to 17%
Okay.
range. I believe the demographics in Manitoba are somewhere in the 17% range, but that's a number, right?
Right.
The number doesn't tell us everything. I mean, it could also contain a lot of inaccuracies, right? Like
Yeah.
what is the nature of Indigenous identity? Like, are
Yeah.
there certain nations overrepresented? I mean, we're not
Hmm.
drilling down, but in a comparative sense, if you go back 100 years, obviously
Yeah.
there's some distance traveled, which is good.
Yeah.
And then the question is, how do we build the curriculum and the experiences and what the law school
Yeah.
does to sort of meet those needs in the context of a monopoly law school where
Yeah. We're the only one.
we're the only one. We're providing the education of a large majority for a large majority of the province's lawyers.
Yeah.
How do we give every single one of them, however boutique their practice might end up being, a sense of the importance of Indigenous legal orders, culture, history,
Yeah.
and futures, right?
Mhm.
Including the economics side.
Yeah.
How do you give them that exposure? But we also have to educate students who don't ever imagine doing that kind of work as well, right? I mean, we have students that want to come in and maybe their role is to throw any random example out. Maybe they want to be an entertainment lawyer,
Yeah.
right? And they're not interested in Canada's history, maybe, right? They don't want to know the full story. They just want to know, like, how do you write the contract? How do you negotiate the best deal? Like what are the regulatory impediments? How do collective agreements work? Like might be a very linear thing they're looking to do, and we have to educate that person in the same way we're going to educate someone that wants to go and work in community, like say for a reserve community or something.
Yeah.
And we have to solve both of those
Yeah.
problems. And so,
But what if their entertainment law client is an Indigenous
well,
person
that's exactly right.
or an Indigenous theater group
Exactly.
or band,
That's
like
exactly
rock
right.
band,
That's right. So the lens we take is that everyone here is going to be dealing with a client base which has some similarities, and one of the pieces of connective tissue that runs through this province in particular is Indigenous identity. There's no question about it.
Well, yeah.
So even if unless you're moving to Los Angeles, and even then there's going to be other issues that come up with identity. But if you're moving,
Yeah.
if you're staying in the province and you're doing entertainment law work, you're going to have Indigenous clients. So we try to tell those folks that are really, you know, corporate commercial interested or very boutiquey, this isn't a question of politics or reformation or decolonization, as you said, right?
Mhm.
This is as a matter of good business.
Yeah.
You have to understand where people are coming from, where they're going, what their lived experiences are, how they might approach knowledge, how they might approach IP,
Yeah.
right? What they think of as something that's a game changer for them or something that's non-negotiable. You have to understand all that, and there's a cultural competence piece there that you have to have, even if you want to unplug from all of the calls to action.
Mhm.
As an individual, you want to make that choice, or you don't want to talk about genocide, right? You don't want to talk about the atrocities that have happened.
Yeah.
You just want to live in your bubble.
Mhm.
Um, and you can do that,
Yeah.
but you still have to negotiate in the context of you have an Indigenous client who's got all of that lived experience,
Yeah.
or is related to someone who has all that lived experience. I mean, you're just going to be an
Yeah.
inadequate solicitor, right?
Yeah. It's
Uh,
part and
yeah,
parcel. It's
yeah,
it's part
it,
of the whole
yeah.
picture.
So we're educating, everything from soup to nuts in a lot of ways, and like I say, the connective tissue that runs through a critical piece of Manitoba's history is and present and future, frankly, is
Yeah.
that Indigenous identity piece. So I think what's
Yeah.
exciting, and
Yeah.
I can see this from my view because I've been here, I've been in the province since 2006,
Yeah.
and I've been at the law school since 2016.
Yeah.
Uh, I can see, despite all of the like left to right and right to left shifts that happen in society, like, we're seeing that all the time in the
Yeah.
modern election histories
Hmm.
and the recent US election and left to right, right to left, like,
Hmm.
are we going to be nationalists? Are we going to be open borders? Like
Yeah.
in Manitoba, I'm seeing a cohesive understanding that the issue of Indigenous histories, identities, ceremony, practices, culture, law, economics, nation building, uh, sovereignty, integration, rearticulation, new treaties, old treaties, reinterpretations of treaties, artistic works, licensing opportunities, whatever.
Yeah.
There's a sense that this is part of our shared destiny. It's not a right or left
No.
issue, right? It transcends. This is why sort of all of the EDI, equity, diversity, inclusion,
Yeah.
accessibility debates and wars of the last several years that were the culture wars, the right calls it, right?
Hmm.
Um, that some of those may intersect with Indigenous identity as we experience them in a law school. Like there
Hmm.
might be moments where there's an intersection, but the actual issues of Indigenous history, the atrocities committed, the possible futures, the healing,
Hmm.
right? The solutions, of which we haven't really developed a
Yeah.
cohesive set of answers for.
Yeah.
All of those things transcend those left-right debates, right? They transcend the culture wars. There is no culture war on this issue, and I think that consensus has emerged crystal clear in the last decade for sure.
Yeah.
And I've seen it at the law school in real time.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating discussion with you. This is Richard Jochelson, Dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Manitoba. I think we're going to have to come back in a few months and have another chat and talk about where the law school is at and going and any new programs because there's always something new going on here. We do have a tradition of innovation, that's for sure, for such an old law school. Uh, we're doing a lot of new and interesting things all the time. So I think I'm going to have to let you run off to probably another meeting. You're a very busy individual. Uh, but I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to join me and chat about um, the law school from your perspective as dean and a little bit about your research. Always very interesting. And our professors here at Robson Hall are always doing some amazing research and teaching really interesting courses, as you told us about the clinics and some of the stuff that you've done.
Yeah, and I really
So,
hope we do have a chance to come back and talk about the professors and the classes. There are amazing things happening in terms of individual achievement
yeah,
and team achievement for larger groups of cooperators
wow,
and partners. But
yeah,
yeah, it's an amazing group, amazing set of professors doing amazing things,
yeah,
and
yeah,
none of the other stuff, the access to justice pieces, the Indigenous initiatives,
yeah.
the experiential learning, the clinics, none of that would be possible without that solid research and pedagogical foundation that those professors bring.
And I also just want to add that not only on faculty and within the walls of this building, Robson Hall, are all these fascinating people who are doing all this amazing work. Our entire legal community in Manitoba steps up for our law students, don't they?
Yeah, that is one of the most amazing pieces of doing this job was seeing how supportive our practice community is
Yeah,
in a way that, and 50% of our connection to industry, let's say,
yeah,
whether that industry is post-secondary education
yeah,
or business or law,
right.
50% of it, 50% of everything we do is really that connection
Yeah.
is supported by and also for that connection to practice. So
Mhm.
the Law Foundation, the Manitoba Law Foundation has been an amazingly supportive funder and partner in all of the development that's happened here. The Law Society of Manitoba has been, incredibly supportive. The Manitoba Bar Association,
Yes.
all of the clinical advancement, the access to justice advancement that has happened wouldn't have been possible without that. The link
Yeah.
to the practice community, which includes not just those three agencies, but the individuals who are at various firms and
Yeah.
working in-house across the province. In some ways, that sustains us more from a moral, ethical, and support relationship than our relationship with the university itself. Now we need the university.
Yes.
We love you, university. You're so
Yes.
important to us.
Yes.
But
We're on the Fort Garry campus.
absolutely. But that part that community connection is
Yeah.
is so strong that the school would not be the same if we just were a commuter campus that had no connections to the practice community.
The students of today are going to be the practicing lawyers of tomorrow and the judges of tomorrow, aren't they?
They are in some cases sooner than we realize, right? It's an exciting place to work,
Yeah.
to learn, to teach,
Yeah.
and to just to be part of.
Very much so. Well, thanks again for joining me. And
Pleasure
thank
being
you for
here.
joining us at Robson Radio, the official podcast of University of Manitoba's Faculty of Law. And tune in next time for more stories and information and news from Western Canada's oldest law school.